Welcome to the emoji equation of exchange. This is my attempt to introduce you to what I think is the most powerful equation in macroeconomics, and I'm going to try and use some emojis to explain how it works. So, the most powerful equation in macroeconomics. It rests on a fairly simple identity which says that total spending is equal to total receipts. So this is going to be true by definition, and it's the foundation of the equation that we're going to be looking at. Whatever the spending is in the economy, that must be the same as the amount of receipts being taken. Now we can split spending into two categories. One element of spending is the actual amount of money there is available to spend in circulation. So the amount of money that there is to spend, which is represented by this bag of dollars. Also, however, the factor that can affect total spending is not just necessarily how much money there is, but also people's desire to spend money. So this flying wad of bills is telling us the extent to which people wish to spend the money that is already in circulation. Total spending goes up either because there's more money or because people want to spend more of the money that's already in existence. Now that is equal to total receipts, which is the nominal value of goods and services being exchanged. So if you go to the supermarket and you get your receipt, that is telling us the nominal value, the value in cash terms of the goods and services that are being exchanged. Now that side of the equation can be split up into two components as well. When you buy your grocery shopping and you're looking at your receipt, what you're seeing is a reflection not only of the value of the goods and services, but also the impact of inflation on that. So inflation is the price tag. We've also got the real underlying value of the goods and the services being exchanged. And in the global economy, oil is such an important commodity. I've used an oil drum to represent that. This is the difference between real and nominal factors in macroeconomics, where real factors strip out the impact of inflation. Nominal factors include the units of money that we are using in exchange. Another word for saying total spending is aggregate demand. Another concept that relates to total receipts is nominal GDP. When we measure GDP, it can be calculated either in terms of expenditure, i.e. our spending, or income. The result is going to be the same. Therefore, nominal GDP is just another way of saying nominal income. And all of these words, as far as I'm concerned, are interchangeable. Total spending, aggregate demand, nominal GDP, nominal income, these are all telling us the same thing. Economic textbooks and many newspapers will probably use aggregate demand mostly. Nominal GDP is probably the most common indicator that we see that we are measuring. Personally, I think total spending makes more sense than aggregate demand. But as long as we recognize that these are all essentially talking about the same thing, they shouldn't be too confusing. Now, conventionally, the equation of exchange is represented algebraically with letters rather than emojis. So just so that we understand what those are, the amount of money available to spend, that's typically referred to as M, that's our money supply. V is velocity, that's this circulation of existing money units, that's people's desire to spend money. Inflation is commonly referred to as P, and the real value of goods and services exchanged, or income, is Y. Now, I've also added here the emoji for unemployment. Ultimately, it's unemployment that is a factor that we have to pay close attention to. So whilst real growth, Y, is important in the economy, that is closely linked to unemployment, and unemployment is an important macroeconomic indicator. Okay, let's see what we can do with this model a little bit. In terms of the causes of temporary inflation, so this is just bringing back the emoji equation. The causes of temporary inflation, there can be several causes of temporary inflation. If people want to spend more money for whatever reason, if there's an increase in spending, or if there's a fall in the real value of goods and services exchanged. So if there is some kind of a contraction in terms of our economic capacity and there's a reduction in real growth, if there's an increase in people's desire to spend money, just by looking at our equation, we can see that either of those two factors are going to cause an increase in inflation. If M plus V equals P plus Y, rise in V or a fall in Y is going to have an upward pressure on inflation. However, there is only one cause of persistent inflation, and this rests on the claim that the people's desire to spend money is reasonably stable. Also, real GDP growth tends to be reasonably stable. This doesn't mean that they're fixed, but it certainly means that over long periods of time they don't change by a dramatic amount. Now, if that's the case, and we can ignore V and Y and put them to one side as being reasonably stable, or at least offsetting each other, then if there's an increase in M, then that will follow through into an increase in P. This is the standard way of thinking about monetarism, which is the argument that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and as long as V and Y are reasonably stable, then this is going to be the case. In other words, if we want to understand what's happening with inflation, we need to see what's happening to the money supply. It's because of an excess of money supply over the demand to hold it. We can also use this model to think about the causes of real growth. So if it's the case that excessive money supply creation simply leads to inflation, then this begs the question about what causes an increase in the real value of goods and services exchanged, in other words, in real GDP. In this case, if we want to understand the cause of a real value of goods and services exchanged to go up, it's not because of what's happening on the left-hand side of our equation here in terms of aggregate demand. Ultimately, aggregate demand changes are just going to cause inflation. What actually affects real GDP growth is another variable which is referred to as productivity. So productivity is something kind of outside of this model. We'll talk about why we can be able to affect productivity, but it's productivity ultimately that economists think will drive real GDP growth. Nominal GDP growth can be perfectly affected by central banks or by policymakers who are seeking to affect aggregate demand, but only in as much as our changes in aggregate demand affect inflation. If we want to understand the causes of real growth, we need to look at productivity. That doesn't mean that we can't affect growth temporarily. In the short run, economists tend to think that changes in aggregate demand not only affects inflation, but can also have an impact on real growth. So if any of that left-hand side increases, then there will be inflation, of course, but also potentially a small amount of impact on real GDP growth temporarily. Now, if we think about aggregate demand policy or aggregate demand management, we can think about different ways in which policymakers can affect aggregate demand. Remember, total spending is aggregate demand. One way that we can increase total spending is by simply creating more money. So if we think of quantitative easing as essentially referring to a change in the absolute amount of money available, then one way we can affect total spending is by having more money. The other way to increase total spending is to affect people's desire to spend money. So how do we encourage more spending? We can reduce interest rates, we could reduce taxes, or we could increase government spending. So let's think about which of these are monetary policy tools. So monetary policy conducted by a central bank. This would be creating more money, so quantitative easing, or the way in which central banks attempt to affect people's desire to spend is by cutting interest rates. Put simply, if we have more central bank reserves or if we have lower interest rates, these are two factors that are going to lead to more spending. Central banks can increase reserves to boost spending, or they can cut interest rates. Alternatively, if central banks want to reduce spending, in other words, if they want a reduction in aggregate demand, then they can have lower reserves or they can have higher interest rates. If we think which of these policies are going to be fiscal tools, then we can see the way to increase more spending via reduction in taxes or an increase in government spending. So these are the two main fiscal tools to affect aggregate demand. Lower taxes or more government spending is going to speed things up. Higher taxes or less government spending is typically going to slow things down. So whether it's the central bank conducting monetary policy or it's some kind of fiscal authority conducting fiscal policy, they can affect aggregate demand in these ways. The fiscal policy is going to be more controversial than monetary policy because there's more controversy in terms of the ratio between changes in taxes and government spending and aggregate demand. The entire austerity debate is essentially talking about whether or not it's necessarily the case that simply lowering taxes is going to boost spending, or whether or not there can be some changes in confidence that offsets that. But regardless of what's happening with confidence, we can know that any increase in the left-hand side of this equation is going to follow through into the right-hand side. Now, if our focus is on growth and we're not simply trying to generate inflation or boosts to nominal GDP, if our objective is real GDP growth, the question is what kind of policy is missing. What we've seen so far is that monetary and fiscal policy can be effective tools to increase aggregate demand, but if that's predominantly going to be manifested in inflation, where does increases in real GDP come from? Well, that's going to come from productivity improvements, and we refer to this as structural policy. You can see here this summary of policy options. I've split this between aggregate demand management, which is monetary and fiscal policy, or supply side policy, which is referred to as structural. Now, not all fiscal policy is going to be intended to stimulate aggregate demand, but to the extent to which government decisions about spending are tied to improvements in productivity or intended improvements in productivity, I would refer to that as structural policy. The supply side is intending to increase the potential growth rate of the economy, which is Y star. The left-hand side here are affecting aggregate demand, and the two main elements are going to be monetary or fiscal. The really nice thing about this model, I think, is that it allows us to understand the three main schools of thought in modern macroeconomics. If we think about monetarists, they will argue that the reason for a downturn is because of a contraction in the money supply, in M, so their focus is on that first variable. If we think about the Keynesian school, their focus is on animal spirits, which is another term for velocity or the confidence in the economy. So their emphasis is on changes in V and policy responses to try to stimulate V. By contrast, real business cycle theorists will focus more on what's happening to productivity and supply side factors that are affecting the underlying potential growth rate of the economy. So if monetarists focus on what's happened to the money supply, Keynesian's policy focus is on people's desire to spend. Real business cycle is thinking about the productivity side. Notice that monetarists and Keynesians are united in the fact that they emphasize aggregate demand phenomena, and their focus is on those kind of short-term policy debates about how to manage aggregate demand. Real business cycle theorists, on the contrary, are focused more on the supply side. I hope that model has helped understand the economy a little bit. You've got the different emojis there, also the letters that refer to the M plus V equals P plus Y. These are two different ways to understand one key equation that helps to understand how policy decisions are made and policy objectives in the economy.